So we are very lucky to have two CEOs joining us today, one for ADHD Ireland and one for As I Am. So we have Ken Kilbride, who has over 25 years of experience in senior management positions in a wide range of very large and very small not-for-profit organisations. His role with ADHD Ireland is to enact strategy of the board and, in the words of Captain James T. Kirk, take this ADHD organisation to where no ADHD organisation has ever been before, which I thought was amazing. We also have Adam Harris, who is the founder and CEO of As I Am, Ireland's autism charity. Adam set up As I Am based on his own experiences growing up as a young autistic person in Ireland. And today, As I Am provides support to the autism people and their family, advocates on behalf of the community, and works to support the public and private sector organisations and communities in becoming inclusive and accessible. So we're really lucky to have the guys in here today. Really looking forward to this chat. So I guess I've introduced you guys a little bit, but if you want to take over and introduce yourselves, Adam, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, well, that's a very kind introduction. Thank you so much. So my name is Adam Harris, as has been mentioned. I'm the CEO of As I Am, which is Ireland's autism charity. We're celebrating our 10th birthday this year, and our vision is to bring about a society in which every autistic person is accepted as they are, equal, valued, and respected. And I suppose we believe to realise that vision, we have to do two things. We need to build capacity within our own community, providing group-based supports, providing the right support at the right time, insofar as we can as a voluntary organisation. We operate an autism information line, and we provide a suite of group-based supports for both autistic children and autistic adults, as well as undertaking a range of policy and advocacy work. But I think the work that really makes us unique and is really maybe at the heart of the advocacy conversation that we're talking about today is sometimes we only talk about advocacy in the concept of politicians and decision makers. But of course, we can advocate for change at many levels within our society. And we believe autism is predominantly an accessibility issue. We look at that through a variety of lenses based on autistic experience. And we work with schools, with workplaces, with communities, with businesses across the country to give people the skills and knowledge they need so that autistic people can have the same chance in communities across Ireland. And delighted to work with Ken many times before and to be sharing the panel with him today.
Well, thanks, Ed.
I'll let you go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
No, thank you.
Go for it. No.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ken Kilbride. I'm the CEO of ADHD Ireland. And actually, I was informed the other day that I was in the role 7 years ago on Tuesday. So the organisation itself was actually founded back in 1980. And what happened at that stage was some parents literally came together. It's typical of, charities and organisations in the sector. There was no supports for their children. And the view was that if we don't do something about it, i.e. we don't create that advocacy out there and get those supports for our children, when nothing is going to happen. And if anybody is interested, that kitchen table's out in Stillorgan. We can set up a meeting. You can go and meet Stephanie. She's on our board of directors. And so again, we've been working, and I have to say, in terms of what Adam was saying, in terms of the mission and the remit of As I Am, it's very much the same for ADHD Ireland. And I would take some words that in terms of Adam was stressing, in terms of, the big thing we see ourselves as working towards acceptance. We can talk a lot about the etiology of ADHD as a condition, and its overlap with autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other conditions as well. But just in terms of, there's other things like medication. But in terms of the way we look at it, and putting forward, that advocacy around changing and creating that positive change for people with ADHD, it is creating that acceptance for the condition. And we'll also say about the condition here in Ireland, the biggest challenge with ADHD is not having ADHD. It's the stigma that can go with the condition. Mm-hmm. And when you have the acceptance to remove that stigma, lives will improve.
Yeah,
that's so true. Wow, guys, thanks so much for that. I really appreciate this. And I suppose my first question for you guys is, what are the current issues you see with people who are coming to As I Am and ADHD Ireland? Like, what are the current issues that are people with these disabilities are facing, I suppose? That's my question.
Does Adam want to go for ROI?
Whichever, I don't mind.
I don't mind. Well, the big challenge is, I was guessing this question from him, so I've actually wrote quite a long list. So Adam will need to wait just for a couple of minutes, to be honest. um, um, the first thing I wrote down about ADHD, just in terms of a disability, it's an invisible disability. And when you look at people who have just say visual or mobility disabilities, you can see that. We're not fully there in terms of society, but you know, when someone comes into an organization, if they need a wheelchair, they start putting in those access points straight away. They don't know when people have ADHD. So it's not always seen as a condition, or it's not even actually seen as a disability at all. So for ourselves, we need to, you know, create that awareness around the condition to get that acceptance. In terms of Irish society, you know, we've estimated that the cost, the socioeconomic cost of ADHD is approximately 1.8 billion a year for adults. And that's a recurring cost per annum. That's not once off. So that's costs around, you know, lack of productivity, not having the supports there, loss of revenue to the exchequer around tax exchange. So it is an actual cost. And I know Adam will also talk about it there, that there is those personal costs for challenges in people with ADHD and autism. We did a survey a couple of years ago with the HSE and UCD. It's the first survey in Ireland around, you know, the mental health impacts. And it was showing that, you know, adults with ADHD, 20%, and we're talking about 150,000 adults here, had attempted suicide in their previous life. 50% self-harm. 10% consider suicide as an option going forward. So while there is this large financial impact to the condition, there's also those personal impacts there around, you know, other conditions like, you know, suicidality, also anxiety, depression, and other conditions like that as well. Where we come from in Ireland is, you know, 5 years ago or 6 years ago when I started this role, there wasn't services for adults. The HS now started putting in service. Now they're not fully there yet, and they'll admit that. So we're starting from a very low base, and again, getting the services is a challenge. Again, just as a larger point I would bring, you know, and I talk about this generally, is that, you know, when you look at the budget, you know, that the HSE spends. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago on sharing the vision, and how it's been rolled out and how it's going to be applied in future. And in fairness to Mary Butler as Minister for Mental Health, she stayed all day. And she was banging the drum about, you know, we can't have health without having mental health. But one of the challenges that we face in Ireland is, you know, currently, you know, the total HSE budget, about 5% is spent on mental health. Whereas we know from World WHO figures, you know, it's 10% plus. So, you know, while they are giving more funding around ADHD and other mental health conditions, it's still not enough. So taking all these challenges together, there is that large hurdle, large impacts for people with ADHD, and this is what we're trying to work on.
It's so interesting listening to Ken, because I think there's such a crossover in everything he and I would say. You know, I think building and picking up a point from his previous answer around acceptance, I think that really is at its core. You know, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, many people would have never heard of autism. There's a reality that of those who'd heard of autism, fewer again would have said they knew someone who's autistic. We now know that in our school-going population, at least 1 in 27 children have an autism diagnosis. And that's in the context of a system in which there's significant waiting lists. So we know it's likely to be higher than that figure. And awareness is a really important part of how we've gotten to there. Increased awareness has meant identifying people younger and hopefully being able to provide the right support, the right acceptance and messaging to that young person from a young age. However, in reality, one of the really significant problems is that awareness isn't the same as understanding, and it's certainly not the same as acceptance. You put the word autism into Google and it returns nearly 3 billion search results in less than a second. And some of that information is good, some of it's out of date, and some of it's quite frankly scary. And I think, you know, for most of the history of autism, we've talked about doing things to autistic people as opposed to doing things that autistic people actually want or need in our lives. So I think, you know, we're at a real tipping point where we're moving from the medical model to a more human rights-based approach to autism and placing the voices of autistic people at the centre. And it's important to say we have made progress, but I think the reality is for many people doing mundane tasks in day-to-day life, going to the supermarket, getting on a bus, going to school or sitting in a classroom, brings a huge level of judgment. So we do a big survey of our community every year. And while consistently people say access to services is the biggest barrier, a very close second is judgment and attitude. And that starts with the child who's experiencing a meltdown in the supermarket and people stare and cast assumptions. and it escalates to an autistic man who looks the same as everybody else, who needs to stim in a public place, and that leads to staring and unkind comments. So those underlying judgments have a really significant impact, and in big and small ways, on the lives of autistic people. I think in terms of where we're at as a country around disability more generally, and obviously that encompasses autism, I think we're a funny country in that, we're certainly a nation of poets and we write beautiful policy. What we aren't is a nation that's good at implementing those policies. So while we have brilliant legislation and strategies and plans around disability, most of them sit on shelves. So implementation is probably the single biggest barrier to actually the vindication of rights of disabled people in Ireland. Another challenge, I think, though, is that there's shared challenges, and Ken and I have spoken about that today already, how much crossover there is, for example, between autism and ADHD. But I think what we have to be careful about as well is that we don't fall into a trap of taking a one-size-fits-all approach to disability. And I think this happens in big ways and small ways. For example, increasingly we're hearing messaging within our education system that kind of implies, inclusion is inclusion, or good teaching is good teaching. But actually, good teaching for an autistic person might look exactly the opposite as to what good teaching would look like for a non-autistic person. So we can't lose, I suppose, a focus on those individual challenges that each of our diagnoses, our communities encounter. And then, of course, what we also can't do is assume that because we've met one autistic person, all autistic people be the same, whether that's in the world of work, whether that's in the world of education, whether that's in our own families. So I think there's a huge issue there around a one-size-fits-all approach in a micro and a macro sense. I think another real challenge that takes place that Ken has already spoken to is a lack of joint planning. Even if we just look, for example, at the autism community, if you're an autistic adult who doesn't have an intellectual disability, the sad reality is you're 9 times more likely to die by suicide. However, if you're an autistic young person experiencing a mental health condition, you will find it next to impossible to get seen by CAMHS services. So mental health will say it's disability services jobs, disability services will say it's mental health services jobs. You get told, for example, if you're a child in the autism community, you don't need a diagnosis to access health supports. However, if you want to place in an autism class, you need an autism assessment. So there's very often the left hand of the government doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And this leads to people falling through the cracks very often. Within our own community, I already mentioned 1 in 27, and that's a huge demographic shift that we're seeing. So what we're seeing is a generation of young people diagnosed as children aging out of the school system for the first time. So whereas we used to talk about, early year settings in primary schools, we're now in a situation where we're actually talking about things like, for example, like the workplace, like, for example, the criminal justice system. So there's a real need, I suppose, for the changes within our society to keep a pace with the changes within our education system. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think really at the heart of all of these issues, if we were to bring it down to a single word, I think what we need to do is build an empathy. It's an irony that for a long time, people talked about autistic people not having empathy, one of the greatest mistruths and most damaging mistruths that ever existed about our community. But really what we're talking about is a double empathy challenge, because it's as hard for someone who isn't autistic to understand our experiences and the barriers that exist in day-to-day life. And if we could do more to put the lived experience at the heart of our decision making, we could go a long way towards removing some of the barriers that our community encounter.
Wow, that's so good. Thank you, guys. It's really good to hear the challenges that you're hearing and that you're working towards fixing. I think you guys spoke really well there. I suppose my next question, moving on from that, would be how to constructively advocate for yourself in these settings. If you would be able to shed some light on that, or give some advice for our students who are struggling with these issues to maybe help them navigate these issues and problems. Whoever wants to go first.
Over to you, Ken.
Well, again, I've done a reasonable amount of talks with admin, and we know each other outside as well. I have to say, when we're doing these talks, we don't collaborate beforehand.
No,
we don't turn up and say this. I'm going to say, you're going to say that. We work with. We're saying the same things because we're coming from the same approach. And one of the things Adam was saying there that we would go on about as well. What is known about children with ADHD, that they will receive approximately 20,000 pieces of negative stimulus by the age of 12. Stop that, put that down, stop running around. Why can't you be quiet? Imagine what that does to a person's self-esteem. Now, in terms, in talking to Queeve, and setting up this talk over the last month, we were talking about, who's the audience, who's it for? We're talking about, people with disabilities, people in third level. But for ourselves, and I think for the autism community, and I think Adam alluded to it as well, you need to start as early as possible. You need to change. For us, we would be quite ruthless in saying this. The school system was designed back in 1850 to reduce people to work in the factories that were coming up in the day. And the concept of having an 8-year-old sitting in the class all day staring at a board doesn't work for any student, let alone those students with autism and ADHD. We would see that there needs to be a radical rethink of the education system. But in terms of that, agenda that we were looking around, the advocacy around changing the acceptance of ADHD, we would also be of the view the first place that needs to start is in school. And go through school, then it's in secondary school, then get to college. If it can start in school, well, then people learn how to work from a neuroaffirmative approach. So they bring that into secondary school, they bring that into third level school, they bring that into employment. Now that's a 20, 30, 40-year project. Yeah. But for ourselves, we need to start looking at the schools and how we get things changed there. Schools' early year setting is really, really important for developing that positivity and constructive advocacy around making lives better for people with ADHD and other conditions.
I would echo again so much of that. And I think, what I think is really important is exactly the point that Ken made, that very often when we talk about advocacy, and of course, long before we talk about political advocacy or anything like that, we're talking about the person's role in advocating for themselves in college, in the workplace, and in school. And it definitely was a frustration in my own life, whereby, I was lucky in secondary school, right up into 6th year when I was 18, when I was having problems, my mom would pick up the phone and those problems would go away. So little challenges, little pebbles in the shoe didn't become this huge, overwhelming mess. And then the minute you step out the door of school, I think someone assumes that some sort of kind of spirit descends upon you and you suddenly know how to do these things for yourself. So whether it's filling out a form, whether it's being able to identify the supports you need, whether it's knowing how to conduct yourself in a meeting in that regard, no one actually teaches people how to do that. And I think everybody probably needs to be taught those skills, but certainly members of our community do. So I totally think we need to align much more closely the teaching of the skills within the education system. I think we also have to be clear that our community has to be able to have representation and support when that is required. And not everyone can advocate for themselves at particular moments in time. It is possible for adults to have advocates to support them, including in third level. But I think sometimes that's nearly kept as a bit of a secret, or it's made very bureaucratic to access. And, it can be challenging if you're autistic, or imagine if you have ADHD, working through systems and forms and so on when you're not stressed. But when you need these supports, you're extremely stressed. So it's next to impossible. So I think we need to get much better at kind of promoting that idea of a person being able to have an advocate or representative if that's what they need. I think when we talk about kind of advocacy in the bigger pictures, the person moving beyond their life, I suppose, into the community, I think there's a few things that are important to think about in terms of constructive advocacy. I think if we look at, I often think, we see the huge barriers that exist for our communities right now. But I think we also have to look at other communities, whether that's the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBT community. They're at this longer. I think the very kind of earliest signs of the autism self-advocacy movement was in the US in about 1993. So there has been progress, but progress in these areas is measured in decades, not in years. So we have to kind of, I suppose, get that balance between really desiring to push forward, but also seeing the small wins along the road and along the way as well. And I think what we've learned from some of those other movements that we can bring to life in this context is that really at the end of the day, Ken and I are both here rhyming off stats and figures and numbers, and they're important for getting civil servants and stuff on board. But I think ultimately how you win this argument is actually people's stories. That's what gets people excited. That's what gets people interested when they realize that these are issues affecting people in their family, people in their community, people in their workplace. And that's why these things are so related. If we can support people to be able to advocate for themselves, ultimately we're building a movement of people who can advocate for a bigger change for the next generation that is to come. So I think that that's really very important. And then I suppose as well, I think two kind of final things that I would say is, again, advocacy absolutely needs to take place in a political context. But I actually believe so often how we actually bring about change is to go out and do it ourselves, first of all, and then try and get others to support it. So I think change can start in very small ways, in one college, in one school, in one workplace. And I think that's only possible by partnership. I think the piece that we really fall down in this movement, but I think in lots of movements, is that tendency to talk to ourselves, and that actually gets us nowhere. We're all probably in agreement today about the sorts of changes that need to happen. It's how we can get that message out into the mainstream, and I think that involves working in partnership with other thought leaders. And I suppose the final point I make that I think is important for all of us in advocacy today, I think back to the COVID-19 pandemic, where many children within our community were unable to learn at home. That was just the reality. We had the longest school closure period in Europe. And the moment our organization kind of put our head above the parapet to say, we need to look across Europe, we need to see the fact that we're really the only country approaching this issue in this way. And, as the data now shows, really inflicting an awful lot of harm on autistic young people. We immediately got the most horrific attacks on social media, very, very personalized attacks. And I think, that's a story from one organization, but I think it's a reminder and a story to all of us in advocacy, and that it's getting nastier out there. And I think, that there's that Justice Ginsburg quote. I don't have it exactly, but it's, fight for what you believe in, but do it in such a way that will bring people with you. And I think we need to keep that at the heart of advocacy if we're really to move forward.
Just very briefly, just to follow on from that, in terms of what Adam was saying, just in terms of ADHD Ireland's view on that type of an issue. I was out doing an interview in TV3 recently. It was, 8 o'clock in the morning. So the skeleton staff of 6 people. 3 of them came up to me, just to let you know, Ken, I have ADHD as well. They hadn't gone public on it, but I'm seeing this more and more and more and more. But my personal it's not in our strategic plan, but I'd like to put in the strategic plan is that we need to organise a parade down O'Connell Street of 10,000 people with ADHD. I think we can get there. We're not there yet, but I think we're nearly at the stage. Give us 2 or 3 years where we can organise a large event in O'Connell Street. Everybody brings a flag. Hopefully it'll come very shortly.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. So I suppose we've one final question here. So hi, by the way, I didn't get to introduce myself in the beginning. I'm Lisa. I'm one of the co-hosts along with Quiva today. But I suppose one question we kind of have here is, how can constructive advocacy help to educate and build community? So what are your kind of thoughts on that? So I don't know, Ken, if you want to go first, and we can pass back to Adam then after.
No, again, what I would say, just, in terms of the synopsis of Adam has given there in terms of the development around constructive advocacy, we're at this 6-7 years. Before that, ADHD Ireland was run as primarily a voluntary organisation. And I'm not giving anything away, and there's not been a criticism, but it was very ADHD as an organisation. Changed, what the strategic objectives changed on a weekly basis. We're now getting through that. We're working towards an organisation and working towards goals. But we started off, what do we need to do? So again, we looked at, what was the mission of the organisation, making life better for people with ADHD. How do we do that? So again, let's run events. Let's run a support group. Let's run an awareness talk. Let's run parenting courses. So we did that for 4 or 5 years. Then we got on the radar. And now we're getting, people coming to us, people were seeing, there's the green paper on our paid payments, They asked us to put in a submission. That didn't happen 5 years ago. 5 years ago, schools weren't asking us to come out and do talks on ADHD. 5 years ago, organizations, I'm doing, several talks on a weekly basis for corporate organizations on supporting people with ADHD and neurodiversity in the organization. But again, I think, and I fully agree. And again, it's not because we tailored this beforehand, but I fully agree with what Adam was saying. In terms of that, while, you can have advocacy and you can focus on that, the minister's office or the HSE or wherever it happens to be. And for ourselves, when we talk about, our support groups, and, for instance, we had a support group for adults on Tuesday night, and we had, 60 people on. We can take more if we have more facilitators, but I call it the world's largest online support group for adults. And I'm going to continue calling that until someone comes up and proves to me differently. But what we always say to that, when we get people coming on a regular basis, particularly for the first time, you've found your tribe. We want people to go away feeling that they've got a sense of community, and that you found other people that you can relate to. And we know that, we have it through a WhatsApp group as well, that they meet up afterwards. They go for a cup of coffee. They've now talked to people about ADHD, because to be honest, the amount of adults, 150, 160, 170,000 out there. How many have a diagnosis? We actually don't know. We estimate it might be, maybe 10 to 15%. So there's tons of people out there coming to the realization that there's been something happening in their lives that makes them different. They have a different neurotype, that they haven't been fitting in, but we need to change that. So they're coming and saying, look, and it's usually the first time they've ever talked to other people about their ADHD. So again, it's all about, you're saying, we can talk about focusing, trying to change things, and I fully agree with Adam was saying here in terms of what Adam Ginsberg saying, we're good at having these policies. We're not necessarily so good at implementing them. And so again, it's great to have it on that piece of paper, but it's getting those real things in life. And, there is lots of support out there. Now, again, forgive me, Adam was relating to there, but, there's been huge awareness out there around ADHD, particularly on social media. TikTok is a huge driver of it. And, it's estimated that about 20,000, or sorry, not 20,000, 20 billion tags with ADHD. And, as Adam said there, of those 20 billion, how many are giving information that's correct?
Yeah.
Quite a low percentage. But again, if you don't know and you haven't done the research, it's a snappy looking video, it looks great. They've 1 million followers, it must be good.
Yeah.
So again, it's creating that, we feel we've got past that perception around what is awareness. I think there's nobody out there now who hasn't heard what his ADHD is, but there is that point around, what it is, what it isn't, and knocking down those myths around the condition. Because, people still think it's a 10-year-old boy bouncing off the walls and that's it. Doesn't go beyond it. And so again, adults can have it too. Women have it as well, which is a new fact for Irish society. And so again, it's creating that awareness and building that acceptance around it so that we can get those 10,000 people walking down O'Connell Street not too far into the future.
Thank you so much. And pass it over to yourself then, Adam, then. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is an important point. I think the journey that we've been on, in one generation, getting from a point in which people were talking about curing autism to the point that we're now at the cusp of a new autism strategy where, locations around the country like the National Gallery, like Crow Park, like major festivals and sporting events are putting in place accommodations to meaningfully include autistic people. In one generation, to see that sort of shift in attitude, that doesn't come from nowhere. And I think a word we haven't used yet, I think that is important, and came from someone in the comments, is that term of allyship. So if we're saying at least 1 in 27, and like Ken, we think that's probably a conservative estimate of autistic people, each of those people is probably going to have at least 4 immediate family members. So there's this natural community of people that we need to leverage. And I see that all the time when I go into workplaces. Unfortunately, there's still a huge stigma that means there's not many employees who want to put up their hands and say they are autistic. But how we're ultimately going to overcome that barrier is the workplace is full of brothers and sisters and moms and dads who want to work in a workplace that their family members will be included in. So I think it's how we learn to harness that community is going to be central to how we bring about change. I suppose in terms of, how can it build community? I was thinking about that, and I actually have the perfect example from the event that I've just arrived home from. So I was in a tiny town in Mayo last night, the town of Ball. It's a town of about 1,000 people between Claremorris and Castlebar, and they've just joined our Autism Friendly Towns programme. So last night, nearly 10% of the town crowded into the local community centre, most of them with no personal connection to autism, but wanting to know how they could make their local community more accessible for autistic people. What have they done already? At the end of their main street at the minute, they're building this huge sensory garden that will obviously benefit autistic people and other neurodivergent people as well, including people with ADHD. In their community centre last night, they launched a new sensory space, state-of-the-art, free for people in the community to use. They already had a quiet space upstairs for people using that community centre. They've put communication boards all across the town. And now, as part of our Autism Friendly Town initiative, at least 30 organisations in the town are going to take training in autism acceptance. They're going to create a town plan for how they can go further over 3 years. That's an example of one tiny community coming together and really without any government involvement, systematically breaking down a lot of barriers people are experiencing in day-to-day life in that community. How did that start? That our Autism Friendly Towns initiative, which now encompasses the city of Dublin as just one example, started in Clonakilty in West Cork and was born out of one supermarket making a commitment once a week to turn off the lights and reduce the music to make the store experience easier. So it shows how these small partnerships, these small conversations can light a spark and can really bring about, I think, meaningful change. I think it's not just about building community. I think these sorts of initiatives are also about building capacity as well. And I think that's really, really important. Capacity within our own community, but ultimately, if we want to achieve inclusion within the broader community as well. And for me, what all of these initiatives are ultimately about is fear reduction. So much of the stigma and the lack of acceptance actually comes from a place not of hatred necessarily, but it comes from a place of people not knowing what to do, people being afraid of getting it wrong, people perhaps having hang-ups about their own identity and experiences and fears. So the more we can do to reduce fear reduction by these sorts of conversations, I think the further we can progress.
That's brilliant. Yeah, no, what you said there about fear reduction really struck me as well, because I'm a primary school teacher myself. I'm also a wheelchair user, and I always feel like, I always say that, like, you know, exposing children to disabilities, whether it's physical or invisible, at a young age is so important, because children become afraid of what they don't understand. So I think that's a huge part to play in the fear reduction, is a huge part of it, definitely. Thank you both so much for that. I don't know, Caoimhe, do you have any other questions, or will we put it out to the floor, or what's the story?
There's actually a saw going above my head, so I'm going to be quick. And hopefully it won't fall through the roof, but we'll probably open it up to the floor so I don't have to keep the mic on too much. If anyone has any questions for Adam or Ken, please raise your hand or stick it into the chat. I know there was a question already from Stephen saying, do you think people with ADHD are afraid to tell lecturers they have it when they're starting college?
Indeed. There was just another comment there in from Erica. She's put on Up Mayo. I was at another event last week, and this is, you know, how things are expanding. The census is coming out in 2027, so they're looking to engage with people around, you know, the questions on it. So we had some challenges around some of the questions that were on the 2022 census. But again, one of the things they were talking about, they had the archivist there, and she was saying that she loved the question where they put in, you know, it'll be opened up 100 years from now. She's saying one of the most popular questions we put into the 2022 census was, do you think Mayo will have won the All Ireland in the next 100 years? But we digress. We do that with ADHD. But in terms of the question then from Stephen, do you think people with ADHD are afraid to tell the lecturers they have it? The answer to that is probably yes. There still is that stigma around the condition. But one of the things in thinking about, you know, in preparing for today was, you know, we do know, because we do an awful lot of work with third level sectors. You know, I'm involved with a few committees out in UCD in terms of helping them become a neuroaffirmative organisation. We have a big event coming up in DCU next month. I was on a panel in Trinity a couple of months back. You know, so there is changes happening. And we see there's more people coming through the DARE system. But, you know, looking through the ahead figures in terms of, you know, the population going through into college with ADHD, again, we know it's underrepresented against the numbers that actually do have ADHD. And we know that, you know, the colleges don't have the resources to support them. We know that there's more children, or not calling them children, but there's more young adults coming through into colleges looking for supports, and they can't actually get them. And that's one of the challenges out there for all third level colleges at the moment, is, you know, that they are seeing this, and we call it a tsunami of ADHD, and that, you know, it's not an explosion, because an explosion happens once and it's gone. The tsunami is something that keeps on coming. And so again, colleges are now beginning to put in the supports, but again, they don't have them. They're working towards it. And so again, I know forgive me, but you know, Trinity had a new ADHD support group last Tuesday. So congratulations them. I see that someone put in that, you know, UCG Galway has a new affirmative space. So there's lots being done, but forgive me, more to do.
Absolutely. Always room to progress, as they say. I'm just trying to see now the rest of the questions that have come in. If my chat box would move down, it's been doing that all day. So somebody had said, where do people go to get an ADHD or autism diagnosis as an adult? So maybe if you both kind of your perspectives on that.
Yeah, so I suppose just in terms of autism, one of the huge challenges that we have is there's no public pathway to assessment for autistic adults. exceptions prove the rule, but there is no pathway to how you would actually get there. As a result, people who want to access a diagnosis have to go privately. We've seen a huge increase in that in recent years, and it's often not about accessing services. It is about, as Ken says, that sense of finding your tribe, maybe accessing workplace accommodations, those sorts of supports. And that one of the things that has been great for example, is shining a light on the many undiagnosed autistic females who are adults. I think that said, obviously what is concerning is if you don't have €850 to spend on an adult diagnosis, the state let you down when you're a child, and they're continuing to let you down now, and that's really not acceptable. There is a pilot program going on in one CHO at the moment. It's very small, around adult assessment, but it's a big priority for us to see that rolled out nationally.
Of course, absolutely. And then Ken, for ADHD then?
So there tends to be a separate referral pathway for ADHD in comparison to autism. And so again, in terms of getting an assessment as an adult, which are people over 18, now there is within the sharing division changing the CAM service to look after people up to the age of 25, which would cover an awful lot of people in colleges. But at the moment, much the same in terms of that. So the HSE within the last 5 years has started having clinics for adults with ADHD. Only sort of half of them are open, and they're not all fully staffed. And again, the moratorium that came in recently on hiring new staff is a challenge. And to be honest, the HSE will admit to it as well. The recruitment practices are arcane at best. It can take a year to fill a post. And so again, they do have the clinics there, but they're not all staffed. And so again, an awful lot of people need to go through the private system. And again, you're looking at the same cost again. Students and other people don't necessarily have that funding to get the assessment. So as Adam was saying there, they've been failed as children, they've been failed again as adults. Again, one of the slight differences between autism and ADHD, as I would allude to earlier there, is that for people with ADHD, there is medication. It doesn't work for everybody, but people will go on, try it, see how it works for them. But to get the medication in Ireland, it needs to be coming through a psychiatrist. So again, each of the clinics within the HSE has a psychiatrist, but there isn't too many of them. You need to live in the area to actually go to it. So then the other challenge is then, can you get it privately? No. There's 2 or 3 psychiatrists doing the entire country in terms of private practice, so they have a huge wait list. So we would say in Ireland, even if you can afford it, you can't get the assessment.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Another question is also for ADHD Ireland come in. What work is being done regarding the high barrier to diagnosis for adults in Ireland at the moment?
Again, just we will be starting very shortly to work with the HSE on this. So again, in January of 2021, there was a model of care launched by Minister Mary Butler, ourselves and the ADHD Ireland. So the basic model there is that, it's understood that, forgive me, it's a broad way of describing it, but ADHD will operate on a spectrum itself. And now, forgive me, one of the things that people with ADHD really, really drive them bonkers is that, someone says, I forgot my keys today, I was late for a meeting, I think I might have ADHD. That drives them bananas. To have ADHD, it has to be a serious impairment in your lives. We're talking about higher instances of, marital breakdown, higher rates of substance misuse. We mentioned suicidality. We mentioned the mental health problems. It's not something that, you just brush off and it goes away. And so again, getting those supports are really, really important. And so again, getting all this together and coming together in the one place. And this is one of the other challenges that comes back to the system, it's the no wrong door. Because, you have to go through this door. If you go through this door over here, you're not getting the services. And, that's even more challenging for people with autism.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's really, really a challenge. And forgive me, the other challenge with it is the huge overlap between the two conditions. And and those for children and for adults, but the same exists. Particularly for children, they come in, they go through the CAM system, they get the ADHD diagnosed, and say, you might want to go get an autism diagnosis as well. You then go join the back at the end of another queue. And that's not fair.
Not fair at all.
And so again, there is the services there, they're growing, but as I said the earlier point there, something done, but more to be achieved.
Yeah, always more to progress with. Thank you so much. Michelle, I see that you have your hand up. Would you like to put on your speaker?
Yes, I wanted to say that not only is the not only the issues that you've brought up, both As I Am and ADHD Ireland, but then you've got another cohort of people who may be under the Brothers of Charity because they're in a special school. They can't access comms. They cannot actually access any of those services. They have to go through the Brothers of Charity. And there's one psychiatrist for Brothers of Charity who actually work with young people and into adults who have cognitive disorders or ADHD, autism, all the neurodivergent issues that are going on. And so you don't get diagnosed you get diagnosed as a child that you're ADHD, if you're lucky. But as you get into being an adult, things may come out more. The older you get, especially where there's a cognitive issue, and you're not able to get the service because you don't fit into a particular box. You don't fit under comms, you don't fit under this, you don't fit under that. And it's ridiculous that you've got to fit within this parameter to get helped. There's got to be an overlap allowed, that you fit in this category and this category, and there's an overlap, but you still are neurodivergent, you still have autism, or you still have ADHD. And that's what's so frustrating, I think, for parents who advocate for their children. I know I've struggled advocating for my child, my youngest one, who's 31 years old today. He has cognitive disorder, he has ADHD, and he has psychosis. But he didn't fit any of the standard boxes. So he missed out on several opportunities to get the proper diagnosis and then to get a working solution for him. And I think that's, it's frustrating, and oftentimes parents feel as if there's a wall that's put up in front of them and nobody's interested because you don't fit into this box or this box.
I totally agree, and I think what you're describing in many respects is just the classic example of non-implementation of policy, because the HSE has a national access plan that is meant to be kind of working towards a scenario where what you're describing shouldn't happen. But certainly in our experience, unfortunately, what we're seeing is some teams, some sections of the HSE just seem to decide, no, well, that's not for us, even though it's national policy. I think that is a big concern. And I think it is where we need to get a lot better at kind of the enforcement, not even just the implementation, but the enforcement of some policies, because certainly what we're seeing in instances is people opting out of policies. And I just think that, even from a democratic point of view, I think is obviously deeply problematic. I think the other challenge that we have is that constant tension between creating a space in which disability policy can be focused, and then at the same time trying to mainstream some of these supports. So if you look at, for example, the decision to take disability services of the HSE out of the Department of Health and put them into the new Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And there's definite advantages to that in terms of oversight, in terms of protecting the budget and making sure it doesn't get pulled in other directions. But now the reality is, if you're an autistic person with a mental health difference, the reality is when you're dealing with an autism-specific issue, you'll be dealing with the Department of Disability. But when you're dealing with a mental health condition, you'll be dealing with the Department of Health. But where does one stop and the other start? So it's such a challenging area.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, Michelle, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I'm so sorry to hear that you've had that struggle with your child, and can imagine that has been really, really difficult. So I really do appreciate you sharing your personal experience with us. Thank you so much. Just wondering, have we got any other questions there? I don't think we have any other questions in the chat at the minute. Would anybody else like to come forward and say anything?
Could I just come on board there, Caoimhe, if you don't mind, please? I have ADHD myself, and I was just wondering, I had experiences of it in national school of what you're describing there. I'm just wondering, do you think there's a lack of awareness around the disability or the diagnosis itself amongst, like, say, teachers and lecturers? Do you think there could be more done in training wise to make them more aware of this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Just one of my mantras, one of the things I sort of, said when I started in this role 7 years ago, 2 days ago, was that, looking at ADHD, we know the prime age for getting an assessment is the ages of 8 to 12. And that's primarily down to the fact that, the child has been at home. We all think our children are wonderful, and what they do at home is what they do at home. It's when they go into this social setting of school, and the behavior that they have now looks different than the other 25, 30 children that are in the classroom. So again, taking my age and maybe Michelle's age, what we say is that, teachers are usually the first people to spot it. And so again, teachers help to do that. But in that age range of getting the diagnosis, we know that, boys get diagnosed 4 times more often than girls. And it's pretty much the same for autism as well. It's because that public perception out there is ADHD is 10-year-old boys bouncing off the walls. If it's not that, it can't be ADHD. And so we would always say, if there's 2 teachers down in Kerry who want to talk about ADHD, we will drive to Kerry to do that. Because it's really, really important, as we were saying earlier, to get that early assessment done, because life outcomes improve when you get the assessment as soon as possible. But we also do that, every time, and I guarantee I do this every time we talk to a school, I say to them, ADHD is the prevalence rate about 5%, which is 1 in 20. The average class size in Ireland is 25 to 30. When you did your 4 years training to be a teacher, how much training did you get during those 4 years to support that child with ADHD is always going to be in your classroom? And I love teachers. This is why we do that. The average answer is 0 to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So again, schools are now calling us the word college this year. So actually, Stephen, yeah, we have talked to, DCU here in Dublin. We have talked to Limerick, and we talked to other colleges around that, we need to get how you support children with ADHD and autism on the curriculum for teacher training straight away.
Thanks for answering my question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen, for asking as well that question. Thank you so much. We have another question here. To what extent are the legislative framework and policies provision guiding the rights of persons with ADHD upheld in Ireland in terms of assessment and support services?
Again, I'm sure Adam will have an answer to this one as well. But, as we were saying, one of the challenges with ADHD is not the condition itself, it's the stigma that goes with it. And someone asked the same question there earlier. When we go out talking to particularly corporate organizations, and we talk about, do you know in your organization who has a disability? They're usually fairly, we know whatever is around, visual or mobility. And you then ask them the same question, do you know in your organization who has ADHD? The answer is no. Now that's driven by 2 points generally. One, the person's afraid to tell them because there's a stigma around the condition. And if I tell them that I have ADHD, I won't get the promotion or whatever it happens to be. So certainly there's that as well. But then there's the other question from organizations. That, how do they support the person that they don't know that they have in their organization? So they're looking for people to come to them to disclose, and disclosure tends to be one of the biggest challenges for organizations in terms of supporting people with ADHD, and that they don't always know who is in the organization, and people are a little bit reluctant. Now, we've done a bit of work ourselves, we've had webinars on it, and we did a quick poll at the webinar, and we asked, have you disclosed your workplace? And 25% they had, which was higher than I thought I had, and people were actually saying it had went better. So we are finding there is that increased awareness and that increased acceptance, and it's not fully there yet. Now, I know this is a recurring theme that I've been saying across this talk, is that and things have changed over the last 5-10 years. And I would say, one of the things, and not just that, but the entire autism sector, ADHD as a condition in terms of acceptance and awareness is probably 10 to 15 years away where autism was. And so, we honestly copy AD as I am a lot, and other organizations, what they're doing. If it works for them, let's try it too.
Okay. Yeah, can go hand in hand, certainly. Thank you so much everyone for all your engagement in the chat as well. It's great to get the questions out there. We'll probably be wrapping up in the next few minutes, but if you've got any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box now and we'll put them to our panelists.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, amazing. And the saw has stopped for a moment. But yeah, just wanted to say thanks and really appreciate all the questions and engagement in the chat. And just to reiterate, if anyone has any final questions or comments, make sure to say them now. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded later, or later on in the week, excuse me. And I just want to thank you both, as well as Lisa, for leading this talk. It was actually so valuable and really, really interesting. And I feel really honored to have been here. So thank you so much. I'm going to mute myself in case it starts again. But thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time to be here, guys. Thank you.